Hey guys, John here from Sonic Drive Studio. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you're all doing great. Okay, so this is a follow-up to a blind test video that I recently did. And in that blind test video, there is a comparison between a Mesa Boogie Dual Rectifier amp and a mysterious modeling platform. And you guys basically had to guess which one was the real amplifier, which modeling platform was used, and I also asked you guys which one was your favorite. If you haven't seen that video yet, I highly recommend checking that one out first. I'm going to put a link in the description below, so go check that one out right now. Okay, now let's get started with the big reveal first. Maybe this isn't a surprise to many of you, but the modeling platform that I used this time was the Line 6 Helix Native in my DAW to be exact. It's a great platform that I like to use a lot in my mixes, but you might already know that by watching this channel. But of course, all of you would like to know which one was which, so here's the big reveal. A was the Helix and B was the real amplifier. Pretty interesting, huh? I really had a great time reading all of your comments. I really did my best to read all of them. There were so many comments and reactions that it's kind of hard to say if it was 50-50, but I think that about half of you guessed that A was the real amp, and the other half guessed that B was the real amplifier. And some of you guys on both sides were really convinced. So I guess that we can conclude that modeling platforms these days can do a great job of emulating the sound of a tube amp, especially if you're willing to put in a little bit of extra effort when you're dialing in the modeling platform. And that depends on the platform that you're using, of course. But does it feel the same, you might ask? Well, feel is a term that gets thrown around quite often when it comes to these kinds of subjects. Of course it's going to feel different when you're standing in front of your tube amp stack and you're playing that loudly in a room through that real stack. That's bound to feel different than when you're playing through some kind of modeler through a different kind of monitoring system, of course. So it largely depends on how you are monitoring yourself or how you're hearing yourself play. The speakers or headphones or cabinets that you're playing through obviously have a huge impact on the guitar tone. And it can have a huge impact on the experience of the actual playing. Because you're not going to get those angry neighbors and flapping trousers when you're playing through your headphones, okay? So I think that that's just something that you have to keep in mind when you think about this. Now I could hear some differences between A and B myself, but we'll get into that more once we go over the settings, etc. Okay, so first let's go ahead and listen to the track from the blind test again. This time we're only going to listen to the real Mesa Boogie Dual Rectifier, but this time alternating between a full mix with drums, bass and synthesizers and isolated guitars. Let's check it out. Alright, that sounded really nice. I'm a huge rectifier fan, so that sound is very pleasing to my ears. Let's now go ahead and take a look at the settings and the signal flow. So I'm using my trusty blacked out 3-channel Mesa Boogie Dual Rectifier solo head, the non-multi-watt version to be exact. I really love this amplifier as it sounds so big and raw and kind of larger than life. So we're on the red channel or channel 3 and I've got the voicing switch set to modern. And that modern mode is just great for that classic raw and scooped rectifier tone. And that's that signature tone that most modelers try to replicate. The gain was set to just under 3/4. Presence was set fairly low at around 10 o'clock. Bass is also at around 10 o'clock. The mids and treble are both at around 1 o'clock. I have the loop active, so for the master volume, you need to take a look at both the master control, which was at around 10 o'clock-ish, and the output control on the left was set to just under 12 o'clock. Now something that's important to talk about is the power settings on the back of the amplifier. I have it set to how I always like to set up my rectifier, and that is with the power switch set to bold and the rectification set to tubes. I really like the tube rectification myself, as it has a very natural sag to it. It just compresses the sound in a very nice way, and to me that's just a part of that signature rectifier sound. Now the speaker out of the tube amp is being fed into my Fractal Audio LB2 reactive load box. So the amp is actually dynamically interacting with the load box, just as how it would if it were connected to a real cabinet with vintage 30s in it. That signal is going straight into my DAW, where the impulse response and very subtle room reverb are applied with Helix Native. And those settings were basically copied or carried over from the amp modeling presets. The IR or impulse response that I'm using is from the OwnHammer Workhorse V30 pack from the Line 6 marketplace. It's a great sounding IR pack with two types of V30s, a modern and a vintage one, as well as a blend of the two. And those speakers are available in 70 different cabinet options. And I'm using the high gain mix for the V30 modern option in the 4x12 oversized cabinet. And of course I'm using the exact same IR for the modeling sections. No post-processing was applied to the guitars aside from a simple high-pass filter at around 80 Hz just to clear out some low-end rumble. So to me the real amp sounded great. I really love my Mesa Boogie Dual Rectifier. It just has such a killer tone. But now let's go over the settings in Helix Native. And do keep in mind that you can get these exact tones with your HX Stomp, your Pod Go, and of course all your Helix models. Let's take a listen to the Helix version of the track, both in a full band context and isolated. Here we go. Something to keep into consideration is that the Helix Cali rectifier model was very likely based on a different iteration of the dual rectifier. Like I said, I've got the 3-channel solo head, the non-multi-watt version from the 2000s, but if I recall correctly, the amp model in the Helix was actually based on one of the older 2-channel ones. And those tend to have a slightly different tone depending on the revision that we're talking about there. And just that fact alone can already have some impact on the sonic differences between the modeling platform and the real amp in this case. The power settings that I used and the power settings that they used when they were modeling the amplifier could possibly also have an impact on the difference between the two tones. Not to mention things like the component variances, the tube age, the tube brands, etc. So it did take a little bit of effort to make the virtual amplifier model sound nearly identical to the real amplifier. But I think that I got pretty darn close, especially if you take into consideration the things that we just talked about. Overall, the Helix model seemed to have more mids and a less compressed sound to it. The real amp seems to have a nice way of evening out the dynamics all across the frequency spectrum. With the real amp, it sounds as if the low end is seated more evenly in the spectrum with lower harmonics. With the Helix, things like palm mute seem to be more dynamic, so they poked out a little bit more. A dynamic EQ or some multi-band compression could have made them sound even closer, but I just didn't want to go that far. So like I said, I used the Cali rectifier amp model, which is actually based on a dual rectifier. And here you can see the settings. Both the bass and mids were set quite low with plenty of treble and presence. Master is set to 3.3 and I turned the sag control all the way up to 8. This helped to get the dynamic response a bit closer to the real amp. As you can see, the bias control is turned up quite a bit. And this also helped to make the model a bit more smooth and compressed. So I guess it's safe to say that in comparison to my dual rectifier, the Helix model sounds a bit harder and it has more attack in the mid-range. And that definitely does not have to be a bad thing per se. Here's the IR block, same settings as with the tube amp, the exact same IR of course from OwnHammer. And then, to make the Helix sound even closer, I decided to also load up a 10-band graphical equalizer. Just to sculpt out some of those more honky mids that the Helix model had. Not that the mids are a bad thing, like I said, especially in a full mix, but we're trying to match the sound of my personal rectifier here, and that amp and rectifiers in general simply tend to sound a bit scooped. Some of the frequency bands only have very small tweaks, but the biggest scoop is at 1K, as that is where the Helix sounds more prominent. And finally, we have the same subtle room reverb loaded up, just to give the sound some more subtle ambience. That's all for this video, folks. I really hope you enjoyed it. I know that I really had a blast with this, especially with the blind test. And please don't forget to drop a comment down below. Were you right or wrong with the blind test? Let me know. Also, don't forget to hit subscribe along with the bell. And you can also follow Sonic Drive Studio on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!